Welcome, everybody. I'm Ed Lengel. I'm Senior Director of Programs at the National World War II Museum, and I'm also back in my office at the National World War II Museum. And it's great to be here, and I'm delighted to introduce this program with Professors Gino Segre and Bettina Herrlin on Enrico Fermi. Gino Segre was born in Florence, Italy, shortly before World War II and moved with his family fleeing fascist and Nazi oppression to the United States. His uncle, Emilio Segre, was a Nobel laureate and worked on the Manhattan Project in physics. Gino has his PhD from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He's an award-winning professor in theoretical physics at the University of Pennsylvania since 1967, where he is now emeritus. Bettina Herrlin, daughter of a physicist, grew up at Los Alamos and also comes from a family that fled European anti-Semitism. She also taught at Penn and at Oxford and at Haverford College and served as Philadelphia's health commissioner. And they're here today in the context of our commemorations of the end of World War II, the Manhattan Project, the dropping of the atomic bombs, to talk about their really fantastic book, The Pope of Physics, Enrico Fermi and the Birth of the Atomic Age. So Gino, Bettina, it's great to have you with us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ed.
Thank you. Thank you. Pleasure to be here. Okay, here we go. The title of our talk, Enrico Fermi and the Manhattan Project. And I just want to say, we're in Philadelphia, how honored we are to be part of this program at the National World War II Museum. Thank you so much for the invitation. Next slide, please. Without further ado, I want to get ahead with our presentation because I want time for questions at the end. I want to hear from all of you, our audience. It was almost exactly within 2 weeks. It was 75 years ago that an atom bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. A couple of days later, it was dropped on Nagasaki. This was the beginning and hopefully maybe the end of nuclear warfare. It was certainly the end of the war, World War II, where it's estimated 75 million people died. They perished, that's including civilians and those who died from war-related diseases and famine. Approximately 400,000 Americans died due to the war. So when the war ended, it was indeed a cause for celebration. Next slide. Sometimes that celebration was a little bizarre, as in this photo of a cake in the shape of an atomic bomb and the mushroom cloud. This is at a party that celebrated our military victory in Washington. It was the task forces of the Army and the Navy getting together to celebrate. You do notice that the woman's hat mimics a mushroom cloud. Next, please. So that mushroom cloud became very symbolic of American dominance after the war. It became synonymous with America. It was probably a more popular symbol than the Coca-Cola that gentleman is holding in his hand. Next, please. It certainly was revered in Los Alamos, New Mexico, where, as Ed said, I was where I grew up. And here it is on the yearbook of the high school in Los Alamos, 1954 yearbook. Los Alamos was proud of its role. By the way, I didn't graduate in 1954. This was
You're much younger.
Much younger. But it was my high school that I attended. Next, please. So the decision to drop the bomb was and remains a very controversial issue. It was a fearful weapon of mass destruction, unlike anything to date. There were over 100,000 casualties in Hiroshima. Now that's about the equivalent of the number of casualties who were firebombed in Tokyo, but it was death in a different way. And it was death of a magnitude from one bomb only. And it was a horrible death too, in terms of how people died. Among those deciding whether or not to even drop the bomb was a scientific advisory panel to the United States government. They'd been meeting in the spring of 1945, and in June they came out with a report. We're talking, a couple of months before the bomb was dropped. But they came out with this report, and they said, we've looked at it and we can propose no acceptable alternative other than direct military use of the bomb. The panel also agreed that the bomb could be used on a city without prior warning, in other words, on civilians. That panel only had 4 people. They were all physicists. 3 of them had won Nobel Prizes in physics. They all had major administrative roles. Oppenheimer certainly is a familiar name to all of you, headed the Los Alamos project. But there was one who didn't, and that was Enrico Fermi. And yet Enrico Fermi was considered the most indispensable person in terms of making the bomb at Los Alamos. Next, please.
So who was Enrico Fermi? Well, here you can see a picture of him. He was many things. First of all, he was the most famous Italian scientist since Galileo. He was one of the greats of 20th century physics, the only one to reach those pinnacles as both a theorist and an experimentalist, and is generally regarded as the last person to know all of physics. He was a man devoted to physics, totally. And it was said that he could calculate the magnitude of anything in the physical world, anything related to physics. And here we see a picture of him as a young man in Rome's Via Appia, a famous old Roman city with nature. And what is Enrico Fermi doing? He has his little notebook. He's calculating something in physics. Of course, he's revered in the profession, but to the world at large, he's best known as the man most responsible for the creation of nuclear energy, something for both good and for bad, and as perhaps the physicist most responsible for the bomb. Next, please. So our book is called The Pope of Physics. Why did we write the book? Well, Ed referred already to a number of reasons for that. I'm a physicist. My uncle was a physicist. Bettina's father was a physicist. Our families fled fascism and Nazism in 1939, the same time the Fermis did. In addition, one thing he might not have mentioned, but the Fermis were a mixed marriage. Laura, his wife, was Jewish. He was Christian. My father was Jewish. My mother was Christian. Bettina's father was Christian. Her mother was Jewish. We had many things in common. We felt we understood the family and the physics and the world that he lived in.
Also, he was your hero when you were growing up.
Well, of course.
In Italy.
Of course, as a physicist, he was my hero. And Bettina tries to hold it over me. She says she met Fermi. I know she did. She was 13, right?
Yeah, in Los Alamos on a hike. So,
Okay.
I'm much more qualified than Gino in terms of.
I think I met him when I was 2 years old. My father was at Columbia University, as was Fermi. Next, please. So here we have a picture of the young Fermi family. This is at the beginning of the 20th century. Enrico was born in 1901. His parents were sort of aspiring middle class, upwardly mobile. They had not gone to university. His mother was an elementary school teacher. His father worked for the railroads. And they had 3 children in rapid succession in 3 successive years. Enrico, the boy in the middle, was the youngest. They followed something that was common in those days. For a family living in a small apartment in Rome at the time, they couldn't handle 3 young children. So Enrico was farmed out, where by farmed out, I mean literally farmed out. He was sent to live with a family for a fee, of course. In the country, they raised him. When he was 2.5, he came back to live with the family. Story has it he walked in with them or was brought in and immediately burst into tears seeing all these strangers. His mother said to him, "Naughty boys are not allowed to cry in this family. Stop immediately." Enrico stopped, and this is sometimes marked as the occasion he used to begin internalizing his feelings. Later on in life, he was regarded as the supremely rational man, cool under the most trying of occasions. His children would say later, it isn't that he didn't have emotions, he just didn't know how to express them. So we wrote this book for all these reasons. And in addition, there was another one. We had both written books when we were previously, and we saw this as an occasion to write a book together. But I must come back to this picture for one particular remark. When he came back into the family, he formed a deep bond with his older brother, Giulio. And they had the same interests. They did everything together. When Enrico was 13, tragedy struck the family. Giulio died suddenly. Enrico was grief-stricken, so was his sister, and his mother fell into a deep depression from which she never recovered. Another thing happened almost immediately after that. Fermi discovered science and mathematics. He found somehow he bought a used book and he loved it. He devoured it and he was immensely good at it. Fermi was launched on a career as a physicist. Of course, nobody knew what was physics then. His family certainly didn't. And he was not recognized as such, except by a family friend who said, "This young man is somehow exceptional." Next slide, please. He recommended that Fermi be sent to this elite university in Pisa, the Scuola Normale. The admission exam was very difficult. Only a few students were accepted from all over Italy. At the exam of admission, the committee recognized there was somebody really extraordinary. That was young Enrico, then not quite 17. He went to the Scuola Normale. Physics was then a backwater in Italy. Nobody could teach Enrico anything. He had learned it all from reading books, the only great physicist of the 20th century to be entirely self-taught. He was the instructor in physics to the instructors. He taught them. Next, please. By age 25, he was recognized in Italy and in the world as a genius. He became part of a group of young physicists who were responsible in large measure for developing the great new revolution in physics, quantum theory. Here are 3 of the greats together in a boat on Lake Como in 1927. Enrico Fermi, Werner Heisenberg, and Wolfgang Pauli. All 3 were recognized by then. In Germany, it got to be nicknamed quantum mechanics, got to be nicknamed as young boys physics. Next, please. Coming back to Rome, he was made a professor in 1927, Italy's first professor of Italian physics, first professor of theoretical physics. And he immediately began to form a school. Students flocked to learn from him. My uncle Emilio, the second person from the left, was his first student. He had the extraordinary good fortune for that. That was the path that led him to his own Nobel Prize later, and to be a companion to Fermi at Los Alamos.
And you probably recognize him by now, but Fermi is the one to the far right.
Oh yeah, I should have mentioned that. Thank you, Bettina. Okay, next. Did I forget to mention that why he was called the Pope of Physics?
You did.
Oh dear.
Can we go back to that?
Sorry, no, let's not go back to it.
All right, we'll keep you in suspense.
No, I'll just say it now.
Okay.
He got the nickname the Pope because this was Rome. And of course, in Rome, the Pope was known to be infallible, at least infallible in the Catholic Church. And Fermi was infallible in physics, so he had a nickname, the Pope of Physics. But there was more than physics to life for Fermi, as Bettina's going to tell us, right?
So in 1927, he met Laura Capone, who was the beautiful daughter of a Jewish upper middle class family. He was bowled over by her. She at first was a little less smitten, but she came around and fell in love with him too. And in 1928, this is their marriage in Rome. It was notable in terms of she was Jewish, she was marrying someone who was not Jewish. They were from different economic classes, but it was a very celebratory wedding. The man in the beautiful white uniform is Laura's father. He was a captain in the Navy.
Wait a second, admiral.
Sorry, admiral in the Navy. And he, of course, was Jewish. And at this celebration, little did he suspect that 10 years from them, he would not be protected as he thought he was by Mussolini, and tragically died at Auschwitz a few years after that. The same time, next please, the year after that, Fermi, to our far right there, was honored. He was tapped by Mussolini to become a member of the Royal Italian Academy. This was an organization that Mussolini founded in order to highlight outstanding Italians to the world in both the arts and sciences. It was considered quite an honor. It was the best and the brightest. It came, as you can kind of tell, with a plumed hat and a cape and a sword, and you were called Your Excellency. There was a slight catch. You also got a stipend, by the way. There was a slight catch. You had to be a member of the Fascist Party in order to be a member of this academy. Next. So let's deal now a little bit with Fermi and politics. Fermi avoided politics as much as he possibly could. He saw himself as a physicist, pure and simple. He compartmentalized himself from the rest of the world. He thought politics was a waste of time for him. And joining the Fascist Party in 1928 seemed no big deal to him. That changed as the ties between Mussolini and Hitler became closer and closer, such as in this 1938 picture in this, of the two of them reviewing Italian troops. And the rumors started circulating that the racist policies of Nazi Germany would soon be enacted in Italy. Those rumors started in the spring of 38. So Laura, who was very much a child of Rome, wanted to stay in Rome, realized that she would be in danger if these rules would be enacted. And her two children, who according to the Nuremberg laws were Jewish, and those were the laws that would be adopted, they would also be in danger. So she agreed with Fermi that it was time for them to flee, and to flee to the United States. Fermi had been there several summers, so he had a sense of it. So over the summer, he wrote clandestinely to 7 different universities in the United States saying, how about an appointment? He heard from all 7 that indeed they would be delighted to have them. He accepted a position at Columbia University, but there was a small barrier too, which was how do you get out of Italy? Next slide, please. Their escape route was conveniently laid out once Fermi got the Nobel Prize in physics. He was told of that in late spring, and they decided that the family would go to Stockholm in December to accept this award, and they would not come back to Italy after that. So ostensibly the family was going just to get the award, come back to Italy, but that was never the plan in Fermi's head. So they went to the ceremonies on December 10th. On the left, you see Fermi, and that is Pearl Buck, who also won a Nobel Prize that year, to his right. And the photo on the right shows Fermi accepting the award from the Swedish king, bowing appropriately and backing off, not showing his back to the king. This was covered in the Italian press, but it was not a celebration of Fermi getting the Nobel Prize. The Italian press said it was scandalous that Fermi did not show up with that whole outfit, the cape and the hat and everything, for those Nobel Prize ceremonies, nor did he give the fascist salute. So that was what the Italian press take on it was. Next slide. They went directly from Stockholm to England, took a boat and the Columbus, and landed in early January of 1939 in New York. Here they are with the 2 children, looking a little serious and a little worried, but I think pleased. And Fermi announced as they disembarked from the boat that we have now established the American branch of the Fermi family. It is notable that for someone who didn't want to get involved in politics, that about 2 months after this, a group of physicists approached Fermi and said, you, and only you, need to go to Washington, D.C., because America has to be warned that we think Germany is starting to build an atomic bomb. And you have the leverage to be taken seriously because you won the Nobel Prize. So by himself, Fermi went down to Washington. This is kind of how his American citizenship started. So next slide, please. It was regarded as a coup that America had this famous physicist. Fermi had hoped he could just sort of quietly come into the country, but there it was in the headlines that he had left because of anti-Semitism. So I think then, Gino, you want to take over? Next slide, please.
Next slide, please. So why did Fermi go to Washington? To warn about the possibility of a nuclear bomb? Well, a very important, a crucial discovery had been made over Christmas of 1938. A nuclear bomb might be possible because that discovery was the discovery of nuclear fission. Let me say a word about this. What happens is a neutron, a slow neutron, as you can see in the top of this picture, when it enters a uranium nucleus, can break it into two pieces. This was the discovery that was made. These two pieces, one are a barium nucleus, the other is a krypton nucleus, and other neutrons can be emitted, together with an enormous release of energy, greater than any other source of energy at the time. Now, if you packed a lot of uranium nuclei together in some form, the neutrons emitted in that first reaction could strike more uranium nuclei, which in turn could fission and in turn release more energy and in turn release more neutrons. If you could control this, the whole package, the neutrons, the uranium nuclei and all, you might have a bomb. This alarmed many, many physicists, and that was why Fermi went to Washington. He also, in his Columbia laboratory, began immediately to see whether it was even possible to have such a chain reaction. It was a very delicate maneuver, because if the neutrons were not just exactly the right velocity, they wouldn't create the fission. If you had the wrong number of uranium nuclei packed together in the wrong way, it might fizzle before you had a chain reaction, or it might pre-detonate. It was by no means clear that a weapon could be built, or even that a nuclear chain reaction would be possible. But Fermi was trying to explore this. However, the United States was not thinking that way. They were not at war. There was a large isolationist group in Congress. And so there was not much support for Fermi or others who were interested in seeing if a nuclear chain reaction was possible. That all changed on December 7th, 1941. Next slide. We all know what happened. The United States was now at war. The reaction to being at war was alarm. Now we were at war with Germany, and if Germany created a nuclear weapon before we did, we might lose that war. The United States was put on a high alert. In the spring of 1942, the Manhattan Project was set into motion, a coordinated government effort to see if a bomb could be built. And in particular, the first step was to see if a nuclear chain reaction could be achieved. Who would lead that effort? It was clear there was only one person who could be chosen to lead that effort, and that person was Enrico Fermi. The Manhattan Project, part of the Manhattan Project, to see whether a chain reaction was possible, was moved to Chicago, far away from both shores. For safety reasons, it was headed by Arthur Compton, the leading physicist at the University of Chicago, and the experiment itself was headed by Fermi. Next slide, please. The experiment involved having just the right amount of uranium and just the right amount of graphite to slow down the neutrons. It would be 1 million pounds of material, all made of 20-pound graphite bricks, with each brick having in it a 5-pound ball of uranium. The whole thing, the activity in it, would be controlled by rods which could be inserted in and out of this construction known as the pile. You see in the lower left a man operating a pile. This pile was built on a squash court underneath the University of Chicago's football stadium. At the time, football was not being played at the University of Chicago. It was a safe place. Safe place, perhaps we should qualify that, because if the experiment didn't work, and the pile blew up, the University of Chicago would be destroyed by the radioactivity and perhaps even the city of Chicago. The head then of the group, Arthur Compton, decided, do I need to warn the president of the University of Chicago that we're conducting this kind of experiment in the midst of his university? He said, ethically, I need to, but if I do, I know what his answer will be. You can't do this. So he went to Fermi and he said, Fermi, are you absolutely sure you know this will work the way you intend it to? Fermi, cool as always, said, yes. And so the project went forward. In the month of November 1942, they assembled the pile. On the night of December 1, Fermi said, when the 56th layer has been put in place, the last bricks are there, the pile will be ready to initiate a nuclear chain reaction. Next slide, please. On the morning of December 2nd, 1942, the final experiment was ready to go. A group of some 35 leading scientists who had contributed to its building were assembled on an observation deck with Fermi in the middle giving the orders to remove the rods one by one, the controls. He checked everything. All was working perfectly as he envisioned. By early afternoon, he said, we're ready to start the final phase of the experiment. At 3 o'clock, he said, things are all in place. Suspense was building. The numbers were being called out by the one woman present, Leona Woods, a student of Fermi, as the rods were removed one by one. At 3:45, he said, let's begin to pull out the last rod. Halfway pulled out, Fermi said, another inch or two, and then the chain reaction will begin. At 3:49, he announced, it has begun. A hush fell over the group. As the suspense built, the numbers began to rise exponentially as the first controlled chain reaction ever took place. At 3:53, 4 minutes of suspense after that, he said, everything has worked perfectly. Zip in, that's the order to reinsert the rods. The numbers began to fall, and they continued to fall until what they had been before the rod had been eliminated. A deep sigh was breathed by everybody. Next slide, please. One of the physicists, a leading one who later would win his own Nobel Prize, had put aside a carafe of wine to mark the occasion. All those present took a sip and they signed their name to the straw surrounding the bottle of Chianti. There was one person not present, Arthur Compton. As soon as Fermi had ordered the zip in, had run to his office to call Washington, to call James Conant, the head of the organizing for the Manhattan Project, and he gave him the coded message. The Italian navigator has landed. It all worked even before we thought it was possible. And Conant replied to Compton, and were the natives friendly? And Conant's answer was, yes, everyone landed safe and sound. The first chain reaction had been controlled, nuclear chain reaction had been achieved. Next slide, please. The Manhattan Project was already well underway because they could not wait to ensure that a chain reaction was possible, but there was faith that it would be, because there was this belief that in Fermi, and of course, in the whole Manhattan Project, already 3 sites were being established, one at Oak Ridge in Tennessee, one in Hanford in the state of Washington, and one in New Mexico at Los Alamos, because that's where the bomb would be assembled. There were two avenues to the bomb I might mention now. There were two materials that could be used. One was uranium, as I described. The other was plutonium. Fermi was a key to both. He traveled back and forth from Hanford to Oak Ridge, and finally in 1944, he would be ready to go to Los Alamos, a project already underway. Next, please.
So I thought I would give you a tour of my hometown, Los Alamos. Here is Los Alamos, the gate at Los Alamos in 1944. That is the pass that was given to Fermi's daughter, Nella. The family moved there in 44. It was a gated city. I grew up in a gated community. And you had to have a pass to get into Los Alamos and go through that gate. It was a secret city. It was not on any map. It did not have an address other than a post office box number 1663 in Santa Fe. And by the end of the war, about 5,000 people had that address. It was
including a few children, right?
Yes.
Who were born in that postal box, right?
Exactly. Not I. But next slide, please. All of the cities were secret cities where people were told, do not say anything about what you are doing. Even Vice President Truman did not know what was going on with the Manhattan Project. He didn't know until he was sworn in after Roosevelt's tragic death. When he was sworn in on April 12th, 1945, the Secretary of War pulled him to the side and said, Mr. President, there's something I need to tell you. That is how Truman found out about it. And Fermi, who had in 1940 failed an Army background check. They considered him a security risk because he had been a member of the fascist party. And then in 1941, he was considered an enemy alien, as were Italians and Germans throughout the United States. But by 1943 and 44, he had become one of America's most trusted scientists. And he was given a name that when he traveled outside of the gates, the name was Henry Farmer. He was no longer Enrico Fermi. That's how reservations were made, whether they were plane reservations or train reservations. And he traveled outside of the gates, always with a bodyguard. So that was the level of secrecy. Los Alamos, next slide, please, was in a beautiful spot, but it was a rather ugly place. These are the barracks that people lived in, very simple. It was muddy part of the year. It was dusty part of the year. Laura, Enrico's wife, when they came to Los Alamos, they were issued blankets and sheets that were stamped USED, used. She was a little insulted by that, but it turned out that USED stood for the United States Engineer Detachment. But it was not an easy place to be. It was a hierarchical society, and there was a cult of masculinity very much to Los Alamos. Next slide. At the same time, there was incredible intensity to the work. Here's a work session in 1943. Fermi is front row third from the left. Right behind him is Richard Feynman. To the right of Feynman is Robert Oppenheimer. And you can feel that intensity. One of the remarkable things is about Los Alamos and the Manhattan Project is the average age of the scientists then was 29. That's who was in the hands of 29-year-olds, the future of our country. Fermi was among the older. He was 43. Many of them were immigrants and had families still in Europe. And many of them were Jewish, and there was a huge effort. We have to beat Nazi Germany to this bomb. Next slide, please. Luckily, they did. And in July of 1945, it was time to test whether they had been successful. And that test was done at Trinity, which is in the desert of New Mexico, quite a ways from Los Alamos, by the way. And nobody was quite sure whether it was going to work, except Fermi was. Fermi was quite sure it was going to work. So they gathered at 5 a.m. in the morning to test this detonation. And so Fermi, with some other scientists, was about 10 miles from ground zero. And the bomb, known as the Gadget, that was the code name for the bomb went off and the mushroom cloud formed. At that point, Oppenheimer, who was always eloquent, quoted from a Sanskrit scripture and said, "I have become death, destroyer of worlds." Another scientist said, "Now we're all sons of bitches." But Fermi was Fermi, and Fermi was busy calculating. And there had been a betting pool before this saying how many tons of TNT would be equivalent to this bomb. And Fermi decided that he would find out. He had brought a large piece of paper with him to the test site. He tore it up in little pieces. And as the shock wave reached him, he threw those pieces of paper up in the air. And when the shock wave went beyond them, he went to measure how far they had traveled. And by that measured everything always, he could calculate that the bomb was the equivalent of 10 kilotons of TNT. And as usual, he was the closest to any of the bets. Today, that site is commemorated by the obelisk. It's open a couple of times a year. When we were there, it's a very eerie place. Next, please.
With the war over, Fermi wanted to return to pure physics. And he did just that, except he had to continue to serve on government advisory committees. But his focus was on physics. He founded the greatest post-war school of physics in the United States. He trained an enormous number of students. We've just marked in green the ones who later went on to Nobel Prizes. He was not called the Pope anymore, but he was, perhaps should be called the man of physics. Tragically, at the very height of his powers in the summer of 1954, he was diagnosed with an inoperable cancer, stomach cancer, not caused by radiation. It was a different kind. He just told Laura he wanted to die at home, and he predicted that he said to her, "Get me a hospital bed. You will only need to rent it till the end of November, because that's when I will die." Next slide, please. He died on November 28th, 1954. His tombstone is a simple one, Enrico Fermi, physicist. Next slide, please.
So this is on that same day, there was a broadcast by Edward R. Murrow, iconoclastic broadcaster, journalist, and I usually don't like to read slides, but his language is so beautiful. I'd like to. So the story of the lighting of the first atomic furnace will be told as long as stories can be listened to, for it was certainly one of the most dramatic moments in the unfolding of human knowledge. Murrow, in that broadcast on the day of Fermi's death, also said it was the good fortune of this country that Dr. Fermi found asylum here in 1938, an immigrant. Next slide, please. Last slide. Today, if you go to the University of Chicago, you can see this statue that was done by Henry Moore, the British sculptor. It stands at the site where the first controlled nuclear reaction went off. It's called Nuclear Energy. The football field has been torn down. It's been replaced by the Regenstein Library at the university. It's a big sculpture. It's an imposing sculpture, and people have interpreted it differently. Some people say, oh, it looks like a mushroom cloud. Other people say it looks like a human skull. Other people say it reminds me of a Gothic cathedral. I would like to think of it as a celebration of human achievement by hope of physics. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bettina, Gino. It's a wonderful presentation. We have a lot of great questions. I encourage our viewers to keep sending those questions in, but I'm going to start out with one question of my own. The great Hungarian physicist Leo Szilard, who was involved in the pursuit of atomic weaponry and power from the very beginning right to the end, toward the approach of the culmination of the Manhattan Project, one of his endeavors was to approach President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill to urge them to share their knowledge of the Manhattan Project with the Soviets. In his view, to try to prevent, in some ways, the nuclear arms race that he envisaged happening, rightfully so, after the end of the war. He saw that information sharing as key to that. Did Fermi have any involvement in that? Was his opinion consulted? What was his view on that possibility?
Go ahead.
Well, I think there was right after, I mean, the committee that Bettina alluded to earlier, they said there was no alternative. They felt that they were directly asked if there could be an alternative which would convince the Japanese to surrender. And they said they felt not. So they felt it had to be used, and it had to be used on a city unannounced. Afterwards, after the bomb had been dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there were a large group of physicists at Los Alamos who organized and began organizing really to make sure the bomb was never used again, to share information. Fermi tried to stay out of that. He felt, I am apolitical. People didn't hold it against Fermi. They said, that is Fermi, you know. So Fermi tried to remain as much as possible apolitical. There's one significant deviation from that, and that occurred in late 1949 when he was on the advisory committee to the Atomic Energy Commission. And there was a move to build a hydrogen bomb. And Fermi and Robbie basically said, enough is enough. You know, we have enough atomic bombs. The hydrogen bomb is just the beginning of a new weapons race. We recommended that the United States not embark on a program to build a hydrogen bomb. That committee was overruled. The hydrogen bomb program was initiated, and we know the results of that, the nuclear arsenal we have today. So I would say Fermi tried to stay apolitical always as much as was possible for him. Some people feel too much.
Yeah, I think the other point, though, is that Fermi was basically on a personal level, he really didn't like the secrecy of things that he wanted to share. And that was his stance. And then when the war came, that was no longer tenable for him. But he had kind of a major falling out with his best friend in Italy and his collaborator, Amaldi about that. Amaldi was very disappointed in that attitude of Fermi's, that he had changed about secrecy.
And so was Rossetti, of course,
Yes.
his other, right.
Thank you very much. I have two questions that go together, one from Facebook and another from Lois McMillan. She asks, I'm interested in the interactions of Fermi with others working on the project. What was his personality when working with others? Was he a listener or an arguer? And then there was a specific question about his relationship, his working relationship with Robert Oppenheimer.
Shall I go first,
Sure.
begin again?
Sure.
Well, when he went to Los Alamos, Oppenheimer wisely decided he would create a special division called Division F, F for Fermi. And anybody could go to Fermi and ask him a question, either a theoretical or an experimental question. And he was kind of the guru. You went to him for anything. He always listened to you, and he always gave advice. This was a tradition of his. Even later on at the University of Chicago, Fermi had a peculiar kind of insomnia. He tried to go to bed early, but he woke up every morning at around 4 to 4:30, and then he would work. So by 8:30, he was finished with his day's work and then would go into Chicago with his door open and anybody could ask him questions. This is the kind of policy that he followed at Los Alamos. He listened, gave you advice. If you talked for too much, he would say, don't just keep talking to me. Let me just tell you the answer.
Let me just add a couple of things to that. I think with Oppenheimer, one of the things Fermi felt was that it was waste for scientists to walk the corridors of power. And that's what Oppenheimer did. And Fermi had, he tolerated it, but he didn't admire it. They were very different people. One person, a physicist, said Fermi was always Fermi, where Oppenheimer could be the charming Oppenheimer to try to get resources that he needed, etc. But he could also, there were other facets to his personality where Fermi was really steady. The other thing I want to mention in terms of his colleagues, when they built the pile, that monster, Fermi was right there. He was hauling the bricks. He was doing the work. He worked alongside the workers. He was a Democrat, and with small d, in terms of the way he approached tasks. And he would listen to somebody, but he would also sweat with people when it was necessary.
He would always say, I won't do anything. I will not ask anybody to do anything that I wouldn't do myself. And he usually led in doing that.
Thank you. That's so interesting. One of the earlier slides you showed was Fermi next to Werner Heisenberg, which of course is very ironic because Heisenberg later became a leader in the German atomic weapons program. And Blake Miller wants to know, do we know how far along the German scientists were at harnessing the power of nuclear fission? Was it a close race between Germany and the United States?
It turned out not to be a close race, and for a very good reason that involves the two of them. Basically, Heisenberg was put in charge of the German project, and Heisenberg was a real theoretical physicist, theoretical. In fact, he almost failed his orals exam as a student because they asked him how to build sort of a battery, and he didn't know how to do that. Fermi was the guru of the American project, and Fermi knew both theory and experiment, and so the Germans never came close. In fact, when they were interned after the war at Farm Hall by the British, they were shocked when they discovered that a bomb had been exploded because they didn't see how the Americans could have done it.
But there was no way of knowing for the American effort to know how far along the German effort was, and there was great fear.
Exactly. And so we've got a number of really great questions here. I want to ask a quick question first. George Webb wants to know, where is Fermi buried?
It's in Oak Park. It's a cemetery outside of Chicago.
Okay, thank
I
you.
think it's called Fear Lawn. That's what comes to me,
Okay.
but don't hold me to that.
Kathy Haynes asks, how can I find out who worked at the University of Chicago in the project? My great uncle graduated from his college as valedictorian, majored in chemistry and physics, was given a scholarship at the University of Chicago for additional studies. I assume just to contact the University of Chicago about that, right?
I would guess so. You might contact also the Atomic Heritage Project. They might have some additional information on that.
Yeah, I think I vaguely remember we spent a lot of time in the archives at the University of Chicago, and I vaguely remember that there was a list of people who were involved in the project someplace in those archives if she wants to tackle that.
When they reopen.
Yeah, when they reopen. And actually on that topic of research, question from Facebook, did Fermi keep any journals or personal diaries? As you mentioned, he kept his emotions and politics out of his life and work, but did they manifest in any personal documents?
As far as I know, really no personal documents. He did keep a famous green book in which he had cross-referenced all of physics. So if you asked him a question and he didn't offhand know it, he would go to his little booklet prepared just for himself and quickly give you an answer to any topic in physics. But as far as diaries of personal recollections, no. I will say that after the bomb, Fermi liked to be in control. Let me give you another example. He always insisted that he drive the car. Okay.
Even with his bodyguard, by the way.
He always wanted to be. The one exception to that is apparently after the bomb went off. He had been awake all night, awake all day, checking everything after the bomb. At nightfall, they drove back to Los Alamos, and he said, I think maybe it's better if now somebody else drive. So that's the only emotional note there I have about the bomb.
Interesting. That's so interesting. Let's go for a couple more questions here. And one questioner, this is for you, Bettina, specifically, on Facebook, wants to know what it was like for you to grow up in Los Alamos. Do you have any specific stories to share?
Sure. Grow up is, when does one grow up? I went there when I just hit my teens, actually. My parents came in 1953. So I went to Los Alamos High. I was not there during the making of the bomb. My father was not part of that. It was, he became part of trying to detect nuclear tests in the atmosphere and was
well, he was the head of the high altitude evaluation of the bomb's effect, and he was a good guy.
So
he tried to go for.
Yeah, he was a good guy, but in Los Alamos, it was a very weird community because it was so sequestered. And would have been a perfect community for COVID because it was very controlled. As a teenager there, it was hard to get into trouble. You couldn't get into trouble, which is certainly the right of most teenagers. So it was also a sterile community, I felt. It was all government housing. I couldn't wait to get out of there, frankly. I graduated a year early from high school, and not because I was smart or brilliant. Or
yes, you were. Come on.
I wanted to get out of there. Okay.
Great, thank you.
I'd also mention just one thing. I know my uncle became a United States citizen in 1944 when he was at Los Alamos. If you want to have an idea of the gated community, the citizenship swearing in could not be held at Los Alamos. They had to go outside the gate because nobody, even a United States government functionary, was not allowed inside the gate.
Right. Right. Okay, so final question, and there are a number of questions, as always, that I couldn't get to. I apologize to our viewers for that. Again, thank you for your interaction, and thanks to both of you for your response. Now, this is a persistent question that I think you've already answered in part, but maybe it'll allow you to segue into your final comments on this. Frederick Chang asks, is there any insight into Fermi's thoughts about any moral dilemma or sense of guilt in knowingly being involved with other scientists in developing a hyper-destructive atomic weapon that could cause the deaths of tens of thousands of deaths? Did he attempt to disengage himself from the Manhattan Project for moral reasons? And please, as you answer that, provide us your final thoughts on the subject and why it's important.
Why don't you give it?
Yeah. Again, it's not there. There's no way we can directly say, okay, here he was. He understood some of the moral implications of this. He looked at the technical side. He was a technocrat. That is what he felt his job was. So that is how he dissected an issue. His wife, Laura, who is a terrific, amazing woman unto herself, didn't come to be that amazing woman until after Fermi died, actually. But, you know, she said, oh, yes, there are moral questions. She did not like the association of Fermi with the bomb. She said he discovered nuclear energy, but the bomb was a different thing. And she tried to make that differentiation. His sister, on the other hand, when the bomb was dropped, she was still in Italy, and she wrote him and was outraged that he had not paid enough attention to the moral implications of what he was doing. Fermi, I think, felt that ignorance is never better than knowledge. That's a quote by him, and that you had to look at these things, and that if you weren't going to find out enough about it, somebody else would. So that was the fear with certainly the A-bomb. The H-bomb perhaps is more of a test of his morality, or maybe his lack of attention to that much morality, and that when it first was talked about whether the United States should go on a program to develop the H-bomb, he said this is nothing but a weapon of genocide. And the term genocide was used, one of the first times the term was used. And he said there's nothing about it that's not evil. So he initially came out against it. And then with the Cold War and the pressures, et cetera, and from some of his colleagues who said, wait a second, you always say that it's important to pursue basic knowledge. You can't go back on that now. And you're a scientist, and that's what you should do. So there's, I don't know whether we have time for it. Well, I may not be able to find it. There's a quote here. He always hoped that people had the ability to, in fact, control that knowledge, but as we all know, that did not always happen.
He also thought, I think, in some sense, that hundreds of years from now, one will not remember these battles and so on, but science will live on. I mean, you know, one of the interesting features of Fermi is somebody is examining somebody who tries to stay rational at all times. He was a simple man. He never dressed elegantly. He didn't care for such things. He put a little water into his wine, but he tried to say that rationality is a guide. And we know how hard that is to remain rational in a world in turmoil. And we see that, you know, it's interesting to see such a person living against such a background of fascism, of war, of immigration, of all of these things, trying to hold on to that rational sense of identity. Bettina, do you have
Yeah,
anything?
and you asked us to wrap up a little bit, and maybe I can wrap up with some quotes from Fermi from our book. Yeah.
Sure.
So the first one is that he felt that once basic knowledge is acquired, any attempt at preventing its fruition would be as futile as hoping to stop the Earth from revolving around the sun. So that's one quote. And then in 1952, at a talk at University of Rochester, he said that he fervently hoped that mankind would soon grow sufficiently adult to make good use of powers he acquires over nature.
Yeah.
Great summation. Thank you so much, Bettina Herlin, Gina Segre. The book is The Pope of Physics, Enrico Fermi and the Birth of the Atomic Age. Thanks for a wonderful presentation. Very engaging, very enjoyable and informative. And thanks to all of our viewers as well for your fantastic questions and your engagement.
Thanks to you all as well from
Yeah,
us.
thanks.
It's been a great pleasure.
Indeed.